Chapter 106, Built to be a Vessel. Yaga stopped Gojo before he could join Geto onto the tatami mats in the training chamber. You can watch from here, or you can leave. Either way, I need to work with Geto alone. Yaga's tone invited no arguments. Gojo glanced over Yaga's shoulder at Geto, alone on the mats, looking across the room at the small trunks containing curses. He stepped back. He watched Yaga cast a barrier between them. He could still see through the nebulous veil, but it was quiet in the small foyer now. He could hear the pulse of his own heartbeat. Yaga and Geto faced each other. Geto, there are different grades of curses in these trunks. I believe you're battle ready, and some of these curses will fight you. I'm not concerned about that, because you can hold your own, Yaga began. When you subvert the curse, compress it, and hold it. And then, Geto asked when Yaga seemed to pause too long, and then pass it to me. It was reminiscent of their last training session, and Geto felt his stomach drop, remembering Yaga's and Gojo's disappointment when he couldn't control the impulses of his innate technique. Yaga walked to the trunks and picked one at random. He opened it and grabbed the curse, released the sigils on the talisman, and watched as it uncurled itself into its full form, a humanoid figure, taller than Yaga, back hunched from an oversized sack it had slung over their shoulder. The curse's face was featureless, comprised of only layers of skin that continuously shed and disintegrated as it moved around. Yaga remembered being brought this one. It formed from the residue of a monk who traveled a long way by foot to Mount Hiei, looking for a new monastery that would take him in after he was dismissed from his previous one. At his former home, he worked himself to the bone serving the community, who showed him very little gratitude and only took advantage of his giving spirit. Eventually, he had a mental breakdown that caused his monastery to cut off ties. He died outside the walls of a temple at the base of the mountain, too weak to request entry. The sorcerers had been called in to exorcise it after the priests were unable to calm or provide any peace to the spirit that was terrorizing all who tried to enter the temple. The curse set its webbed feet on the tatami mats and lumbered straight to Geto. Geto reached his cursed energy out to assess it in the short time it would take to reach him. The curse's arms and legs were exaggeratingly long and bent at odd angles as it advanced. The clothing hanging from its gaunt frame reminded Geto of monk's robes. The dull orange robes it wore were tattered and tinged with blood. When it came closer to him, it lifted the sack off its shoulder and swung it at Geto, who somersaulted backwards and scrambled to angle himself behind the imposing entity. The curse turned and swung the sack again. The whoosh of air blew Geto's bangs across his eyes as he tried to still the curse by bombarding it solely with his energy, but it was too large and heavy. Geto would have to fight it physically. He jumped back as the sack was swung at him again, and he tackled the curse from behind, dropping it face down on the mats. It let go of the sack with a gnarled hand and tried to shake Geto off its back. Geto hadn't done hand-to-hand combat with anyone but Gojo recently, and this situation was one where he had to go all out with his strength. He drew his arm back and chopped the back of the curse's neck, immediately incapacitating it. Regret flooded his gut as he leapt off the curse and jumped back on his feet. He knew he had to do it, but there was something about it wearing monk's robes that made him feel like a monster. He reached out to begin the compression ritual and had to use both hands because of its size. It took a lot of effort before the subverted curse slowly deformed and Geto was able to shape it into a sphere. He felt the curse heavy and still pulsing warm in his hand. Thick saliva filled his mouth. His lips parted. Yaga grabbed him roughly, wrapping his thick fingers around Geto's wrist. "Stop!" Yaga barked. Geto's shoulders heaved as his breath quickened. Drool trickled out of the corner of his mouth, and his hand closed protectively around the curse. "Geto!" Yaga tightened his grip until he drew pain to get Geto's attention. Geto's wild-eyed snap to Yaga's face, and the expression in Yaga's eyes broke his trance. He loosened his hand from the curse, and Yaga snatched it from him and returned it to the safety of a talisman and back into the trunk. Ashamed, Geto wiped the drool from his mouth and turned his face away from Gojo's view. Yaga returned. Geto, he started. That's the technique, Yaga-sensei, Geto interrupted, his voice low and angry to hide his embarrassment at failing yet again. No, Yaga answered sternly. That's the reflex that nearly destroyed you. A heavy silence grew between them. That's what my technique is. That's what I was built for. Geto broke the quiet with a low voice. Yaga exhaled slowly. You're not built for anything. You're a person too, not just a vessel. Geto flinched. Yaga pointed to the trunks holding the curses. Your job right now is to hold, not consume. Geto huffed in frustration. Compress. Yaga mimicked Geto's hand gestures. Pause. Wait. Yaga emphasized his words. That pause is what saves your life. Geto lifted his palms up in exasperation. Why bother if absorbing it works? It works the way eating poison works if the person doing it doesn't value themselves, Yaga told him. This isn't about technique. It's about you treating your body like a trash can. Geto's jaw clenched. I'm not doing that. Yaga shook his head. You are. You swallow curses like you think suffering is your role. Do you know how many years I've watched you eat curses until your hands shook, until you couldn't sleep? You don't hesitate before consuming because you don't believe you're worth the hesitation. Geto held his fist to his temples and fought back angry tears. Yaga's voice softened. I'm trying to train the self-punishing out of you, not the technique. The self-harm is buried inside it. Yaga watched Geto and waited to see if he was listening. He couldn't tell if he fully understood. Geto finally put his hands down, but kept his eyes on the ground. He flinched again when Yaga put a heavy hand on his shoulder. Go home. Clear your head. We're going to try this again until you can relearn your curse technique without the self-loathing. Yaga turned to grab the trunks and take down the barriers around the room. Geto waited on the mats, not wanting to face Gojo. Gojo, observing from the sidelines, could only make out the voices, not the words, from outside the veil. He saw Geto fight the curse. His throat tightened when he watched Geto start to bring the curse to his mouth. He helplessly watched as Yaga tried to get Geto's attention and saw their following argument. Yaga made his way to Gojo and took down the barrier between them. They looked at each other briefly, but exchanged no words as Yaga left the room. Geto made his way to the foyer, his slow footsteps thudding across the mats. He didn't take his eyes off the ground until he reached Gojo. He looked up at Gojo and swallowed a lump in his throat. Gojo stepped closer and touched Geto's chin with his thumb, brushing his bottom lip. You don't need to say anything, Gojo assured him softly. Geto nodded. They quietly slipped their shoes back on and grabbed their coats. The walk back to the dorm was silent, as if the winter cold dampened the sounds of the world around them. Geto mulled over Yaga's words. Was Geto's self-hatred that apparent to everyone around him? He didn't realize how much Yaga noticed his suffering, and yet, time and time again, administration sent him out on all those missions until he broke. He tried to think of a time when he didn't hate himself. He cast a sidelong glance at Gojo. Is it healthy to be so wrapped up in someone that they were the only thing that made it worth waking up for? Did it matter if that was the case? That night, Gojo and Geto were in the middle of the bed, the thick comforter wrapped around them. Geto was in Gojo's lap, straddling him with his legs wrapped around his body. Gojo held him and rubbed his back. Geto nestled his face into Gojo's shoulder. Gojo slipped his hands underneath Geto's t-shirt and pressed his palms against him. Baby, are you okay? You're burning up, Gojo remarked. I'm okay, Geto answered. When his cheek brushed across Gojo's face, Gojo cuffed him on the back of the neck gently, noticing the dry heat of his skin under his fingers. Gojo listened to Geto's breathing, feeling the rise and fall of his chest against his body. My life's only worth living because you're here, Geto said after a while. That's not okay, Gojo chastised softly. If only you could see yourself the way I do. You keep saying that, Geto grumbled. Because it's true. Gojo's hands moved and Geto panicked. Hold me, don't let me go, he pleaded. I'm not letting you go. That's the last thing I want to do, Gojo assured him, feeling Geto's heartbeat quicken against his chest. Geto closed his eyes, savoring the feeling of Gojo tightening his embrace. I don't want to serve a world that expects me to suffer for their benefit. Satoru's the only thing keeping me tethered here. I only feel a sense of hope and future because I'm with him. Otherwise, I would have been fine losing myself to madness so I wouldn't have to see the world as it really is. Hold on to me, Satoru. I want to last long enough to see if you still want to marry me someday. Geto smiled into Gojo's shoulder and lost himself in the fantasy.